There is a strange point that a lot of watch collectors eventually reach. You finally own watches that you once dreamed about. You've learned the brands. You understand the movements. You've spent years researching these watches. Maybe you've bought, you've sold some, you've traded, you've done some upgrading, and somehow the hobby of watch collecting starts to feel smaller. You scroll through new releases and feel nothing, like we just had with Watches and Wonders, right? You open your watch box, and instead of the excitement that you're used to, you feel indecision. What should I wear? You spend more time researching the watches than actually wearing them. And the weirdest part is this. Sometimes burnout actually happens right when your collection becomes objectively better. Today, we're talking about why watch collectors get burned out in this hobby and why modern collecting culture accelerates it. And most importantly, how do you avoid it? Because this channel has always been about something a little bit different. It's not just about collecting watches, but it's about learning how to actually enjoy them. Now, my name is James. I'm a watch collector, a watch enthusiast, and an advisor. And I am all about you knowing and loving your watches. So if you like this type of content, first of all, like the video, subscribe to my channel because you'll see new content from me every week, and check out the description because there's all my content listed down there that you can also enjoy. Now, as we get started here, of course, we have to do our weekly wrist check. And this week I am wearing my Jaeger-LeCoultre Master Ultra Thin Perpetual Enamel. It was a SIHH 2019 release, 100 pieces limited edition from JLC, and just beautiful. Guilloche, enamel dial, fantastic, one of my favorites in the collection. That's what I've got on today for the episode. So this episode is a little more reflective and philosophical than some of the deeply technical topics that we usually cover. But I do think that this conversation is just as important because the longer that I've spent in this hobby, the more I've realized something, and that is that watch collecting is not really about watches. At least not entirely. A lot of it is about psychology. It's about that identity that you have, your tastes, your status, patience, self-awareness, those sorts of things. And if you aren't careful, the hobby itself can slowly transform from something enriching into something that becomes absolutely exhausting. So today we're talking honestly about what watch collector burnout actually feels like. We're talking about why it happens. How did the modern internet, especially with social media, change collecting? And how do you build a healthier relationship with the hobby itself? Because I genuinely believe that you can love watches for decades. And the only way to do that is if you learn to collect in a sustainable way. I do think that a lot of collectors experience burnout before they even realize that it's happening. And the reason is because, unlike with some things in your life, watch collecting burnout is not dramatic. There's no moment with fireworks. You don't wake up one day and just suddenly hate all your watches. It's a lot more subtle than that. It could be that nothing in the hobby really excites you anymore. You see these release videos and you think, well, I guess that's cool, but that's not for me. Maybe you buy a watch, you enjoy it for 2 weeks, and then you immediately start researching the next thing. You feel like you start kind of rotating through your watches faster and faster all the time. Maybe you even start treating them a little more like inventory. You're like, I have to touch this one. Oh, I haven't touched that one in a while. Rather than something that you genuinely connect with. And I think one of the biggest signs of it is that you spend more time consuming watch content than actually enjoying your own watches. Now, understand, I'm saying this. I'm the person making this content, and I'm saying that consuming more content than actually enjoying your watches, that's a huge red flag. Like, that's a problem. Like, if you're spending all your time watching reviews and reading forums and checking prices, scrolling Instagram, and comparing collections, which is the worst one that we're going to talk about. But your own watches barely leave the watch box. That's a problem. And I do think that when you would ask many collectors deep down at the end of the day, they do actually feel kind of quietly guilty about this, because from the outside looking in, it seems ridiculous, right? You have these beautiful mechanical objects, these tiny pieces of art and engineering that many people may never actually afford. So we're fortunate in this space. And yet somehow that emotional connection that they had, it starts fading for them. And I do also think that burnout can create this kind of strange emotional numbness where a collector who once obsessed over movement finishing, let's say, they barely even notice the finishing on that movement anymore. That one watch in their collection that was magical because of the dial or because of the complication, now to them just feels kind of normal. And this happens because the human brain adapts incredibly quickly. We kind of talked about this a little bit last week, especially when it comes to the luxury watch space. Now, I do think that modern watch culture is one of the biggest reasons burnout has become so common, because the internet fundamentally changed the pace of collecting. And now I'm not that old, but I do know this. That is years ago, having grown up in a somewhat of a retail environment, you discovered watches very gradually, right? You had to read magazines. You had to go to a dealer to see a piece, right? If you wanted like a Rolex, you had to go find a Rolex dealer. If you wanted a Longines, you had to find a dealer that sold Longines. And those watches maybe were even limited by your geography. Like you might have had to go take a day trip or a weekend trip to go somewhere that had a boutique where you could buy that watch. And maybe you had a couple friends, that were also enthusiasts. You could stay mentally interested in a watch for years before you maybe even thought about owning it, let alone actually owned it. Now, every single week it seems like there's a new release, there's a new must-have, a new ranking, S tier versus A tier, all those things, right? A new something in the hype now that wasn't there before, or a new controversy, right? Like is the Pepsi actually getting discontinued? Who cares? Who cares? Because the modern collector lives in this permanent state of stimulation, and the algorithms on all social platforms are designed exactly for that. Just think about how most watch content is framed, really, when you look at it. Now, again, I've made watch videos like this. Top 10 watches in this price range. I made a video a couple weeks ago. Your top 10 Rolex watches you can buy right now for $10,000. Now, am I saying that you shouldn't watch that type of video? That's not what I'm saying at all. But I'm saying you have to keep it in context of the conversation of long-term as a collector. Right? There's videos about the best sports watches, or this one watch is going to kill Rolex, or this is the next big thing that everybody's not seeing. Everything is optimized to create urgency. And I do think that urgency is one of the big destroyers of satisfaction in this hobby, because satisfaction requires stillness, requires you to be present with the watch that's on your wrist right now. That's what it requires. You have to have enough time to actually develop appreciation. But a lot of social platforms, if you get sucked into them, just kind of trains you to move right on to that next thing. And then there's the comparison trap. This is a massive one. It is a huge one for collectors. Because you might be at home with your collection and you are totally good with it. And then you go and you spend an hour online. And suddenly you have this collection that is too small, or it's too mainstream. It's not independent enough. Or it's too simple. You don't have enough technical complexity in your collection. Or it's cheap. It's not expensive. That's not real luxury. And comparison, I laugh because these are all things that people say. And comparison is dangerous, especially in luxury hobbies, because there's basically no ceiling. You're always going to find a watch that's rarer, than what you have, or more complicated, or better finished, more exclusive, you'll always find those things. And that means that if your satisfaction depends on comparison, you already lost. You lost from the start, or you maybe lost partway in when you wouldn't have to. Now, there is this interesting loop. And I think that one of the hardest things that people have to realize in this hobby is that loving watches and loving buying watches are not always the same thing. And I do think many collectors eventually discover this kind of the hard way, because buying a watch creates a really powerful emotional cycle. And just schematically here, to simplify it a little bit, first, what do you have? You have the research phase, right? And this, I think, for a lot of people, this might be the most exciting part, because you're exploring, man. You're diving into movement specs and dimensions and the history of a brand or of a model. You're looking at the dial textures, and of course, you might be looking at reviews, or you might start comparing. What's this watch versus this watch? Or what are the upsides and downsides of these two watches next to each other? And that watch starts to occupy mental space for you during that research phase. Then you have anticipation. We all know this one in the world of online watch buying, right? You finally get to the place where you're pulling the trigger and you press buy. And now you get that shipping notification that says your order has shipped. And you're refreshing your FedEx page over the course of a 10-hour day, every 5 minutes, because you're like, did it move yet? Did it move yet? If you buy watches in person, obviously it's a little bit different. But then you get it home and you have the unboxing. You're ready to open it up and see it from the box the very first time. And psychologically, by the way, this anticipation is so stimulating. Because then the watch arrives, you've got it, and for a while, it is amazing. You are just over the moon. But eventually, your brain adapts to it. I talked about this a little bit last week, this adaptation. And the extraordinary suddenly seems kind of normal. And then, what happens? Well, then the cycle starts all over again. Now, I want to be clear. There's nothing wrong with buying watches. We are in a collecting hobby. It's what we do. We buy watches. But the issue is when acquisition becomes that primary source of enjoyment for you over actually owning the watch. Because let me tell you this, if the only thing that excites you is the next purchase, you will never feel settled. Ever. I think some watch collectors eventually realize they're not actually chasing watches anymore. They're chasing just that novelty. They're chasing that emotional spike of acquisition, of just, I pressed buy, or yes, I'm doing this. You want to go ahead with it? Yep, let's do it. That moment, boom. And the only problem with that is novelty fades really fast. Really fast, especially when your collection has reached a certain level. So for instance, a collector who has dreamed about owning a Rolex Daytona for 10 years may eventually normalize that emotionally after like 6 months. And it's not because the watch became worse, but it's just because your brain recalibrates all the time. And I do think that understanding that is really important if you want long-term satisfaction in the hobby. And that's what I want for you. That's truly what I want for you. Now, I do also think that burnout happens when a collection becomes disconnected from the collector. And this might sound a little weird, but this is what I mean when I say that. Some collections, when you look at them, they feel deeply personal. Really personal. Like when you look at the watches in my collection, they're super personal to me. From a timeline, to a story, to an inspiration, all different things. Others tend to feel a little bit like you typed in the search prompt of what's the best watch collection for a man or woman to own in their 40s. And all of a sudden you have this watch box filled with a Rolex Submariner and a Omega C Speedmaster Professional and gosh, I Patek Philippe Calatrava. I mean, just all these things, right? It just looks like the algorithm just boop, just spat it right out, and there's your collection. And you can tell the difference pretty much right away because one collector is buying these watches because they genuinely resonate with that person. And then another collector is just buying kind of whatever the internet currently values most. I do hesitate to name any specific watches here because, again, I'm not here to say that there's a particular watch that you should not own, but just those two that I threw out there, the Rolex Sub and the Omega C Speedmaster Professional, I do think that they're a little cliche. And partially because they're very overdone, they're very hyped, and because they're just those watches that, like, it's the watch that when you would go and ask your friend's uncle who's kind of into watches what you should own, it's like, you gotta have a Rolex Submariner in there, son. That was my really poor impression of someone's uncle. But now, you can't deny, like, they're really iconic watches, and they had such an impact on the hobby. So, like, the Rolex Sub, incredibly influential in the dive world. The Speedmaster, I mean, it's the first watch worn on the moon, for crying out loud. Like, of course they're iconic. So I'm not saying that you shouldn't own those watches, but I'm saying, do you have a connection with those watches? And when I compare these collections here, the collections that I find most interesting are not always going to be the most expensive. They're just going to be the collections with real identity of the person who owns them. You should be able to understand the collector's taste from looking at it, right? So maybe they love travel watches. They have GMTs, or right? Or maybe they love German watchmaking. They've got Lange and Geo and Lange und Teine. Like, they just have all these German brands in there. Maybe they like more vintage proportions, you know, when watches were a little bit smaller, just had different size dimensions in general. I love enamel dials. I love them. I love my JLC. I'm surprised I don't have more of them in my collection, but even still, like, all the dials in my collection, there's nuanced depth to them. It's not just what you see at the face value, and that's one of the things that I love. Maybe there's some mechanical element, right? Like a certain type of movement or a movement architecture or specific case finishing styles. Any of those things. The point is the passion around those things creates cohesion within the collection. And I do think that one of the reasons that I've actually become more satisfied with my collection over time is because each watch serves a different emotional and horological purpose for me. I mean, Rolex Skydweller for me, it is engineering and technology in a watch, travel functionality, and sport all at the same time. My Grand Seiko connects me to the texture, that tactile experience of owning the watch, the nature-inspired design that Grand Seiko uses, and once again, there's technology, spring drive in that movement. And then you have something like the Omega Seamaster Ploprof in summer blue, just pure fun, like pure tool watch, the epitome of dive watches. And still, when you look at the dial, there's a nuance to it. It's not just one color. It's got a little bit of a gradient, and that gradient shifts. And it's also technical because there's a bezel that you have to hold down a pusher to be able to move. Even something like my Girard-Perregaux 1966 Orion, even as traditional as it is, still feels artistic, and there's an emotional draw to it. And it still is modern. So my point is not that everyone needs these watches. I'm also very careful about that, right? Because don't make me your authority, right? Just because James says that this is a good watch means that I should go and buy it. Do not do that. I don't want everyone to own my watches because otherwise, you know, then the next ones that I'll want to buy, people will already be buying them. I don't want that. I want to buy them. But you have to think about, it's got to reflect something personal. Your collection should be personal. And I think collectors will become a lot happier when they stop asking, like, what should I buy? And they start asking, what genuinely resonates with me? Like those, going back to those videos, right, where it's 10 watches of this type for such price point. It's not just about, okay, well, what's this person say is the best and all those sort of things. It's like, no, wait a minute. Okay, I went through 4. they did nothing for me emotionally. Now on this fifth one, this one is interesting. This one is interesting. What's the difference about this one that makes it interesting? What resonates with me? Like Grunefeld. I use Grunefeld a lot from the Netherlands. Tim and Bart, if you're watching, send me one whenever you want. I'll wear it proudly in the collection. But it's like, what about a Grunefeld 1941 Principia automatic? What resonates with me about that watch? Well, there's a whole lot of artisanship that goes into that watch. From how they polish to the materials that they use to the finishing on the movement. Oh my God. Like just the best movement finishing out there. Top of the top. And there's still technology around it because you can't achieve that level of movement finishing without the right tools and the architecture that you have and the materials, like all of those things that go into it, the symmetrical dial design. Just beautiful. That's what resonates with me. So I want you to know what resonates with you in that same way because that's what's going to help you find the watches that you really like. Now we also need to talk about this idea of the endgame watch because I do think that this concept quietly damages a lot of collectors. And you hear this espoused in watch conversations in the sense of, oh man, that is my grail watch. Like once I get that one, I'm done with it. That one will complete my collection. Because I do think the truth is there's no permanent end game here in watch collecting. Because your collection will evolve as you evolve. Like your tastes are going to change. The financial priorities you have will change. Your knowledge, your appreciation will change. You might even have a collector who once wanted only like super hyped up sports watches. And then eventually they fall in love with the dress watch through, who knows, exposure or a friend or a use case that they didn't have a watch for. And they said, you know what, I got to look more into dress watches. I don't have any of those. Or they might get more into independence or vintage or just simpler watches. And I do think that the healthiest collectors are the ones who are never finished collecting. Just think about that for a second. They're not the ones who are finished collecting. Now again, don't take this out of context. I'm not saying just go buy the next thing that you see, but they're the ones who have learned how to enjoy collecting. There's a huge difference there. Satisfaction is not a specific reference number or a certain number of watches. That's another one too. But it's more of a mindset. And I think one of the biggest mental shifts that a collector can make is realizing this fact, is that you don't need to own every watch you admire. You don't need to own them. That's a huge point. Just like let that one sink in for a second. I love the fact that Rolex did an enamel dial on their new Daytona. I thought that was cool. I was like, wow, Rolex doing an enamel dial? Interesting. Now, I'm not going to own that watch, but I can admire it from afar and appreciate that even within the pinnacle, what some might consider the pinnacle, right, of watchmaking, they are continuing to find ways to make little innovations. That's like a nod to traditional watchmaking craft. I think that's cool, but I'm not going to own that because I can appreciate a watch like that without needing to purchase it. Doesn't really matter to me. And honestly, I think once you reach that point psychologically, the hobby itself becomes a lot healthier for you. So let's get into some solutions here because again, I am not wanting this episode to sound pessimistic. I'm an optimist. I believe in going after the things you want. I actually do think that watch collecting can be an incredibly rewarding, lifelong hobby here. I do think that's the case. But I also think that if it's going to be sustainable for you, there's got to be some intentionality behind it. It's got to be intentional. So we're going to cover a few things here. First, slow down on your purchases. Just slow down. Some of the worst watch decisions, I know this for a fact, happen when collectors confuse excitement with conviction. A watch can feel incredibly compelling for 2 weeks, but that doesn't mean that it belongs in your collection long term. I remember I bought a Crador watch once. Now you might be thinking, oh my gosh, the H2, that's expensive. No, no, no. I'm talking about a $1,200 quartz Crador watch with a 36, I think, millimeter case. And I remember, I mean, I had been into Grand Seiko for a while. I had had my Night Birch prior, and I absolutely loved that watch. The only reason that I got rid of it was to trade towards my JLC. But I remember I knew that I wanted a Grand Seiko back in the collection. I knew that I wanted that. And so then I was in that waiting period, right, where I just was saving up the funds to look at and figure out also what would be that Grand Seiko. And I remember finding that Crador, and I think I bought it within like a couple of days of finding it. Like I found it and then I bought it, and it was there by me within, a week. And I was like, probably it was the fastest watch discovery to unboxing that I had ever had, because I thought that what would happen is I thought that it would kind of fill that gap for me in my collection and be that kind of like nature inspired Japanese made like Grand Seiko type of piece, and it just didn't. It did not. So I do think that waiting periods for watches can be incredibly valuable. So you got to ask yourself, like, well, I still want this watch 6 months from now. And honestly, if the answer is yes, you'll probably appreciate it more once you eventually buy it. So that's the first one. Now, second, go deeper instead of wider. And I don't think that this has to show up in a super tangible way in your collection, but it might. And what I mean by this is one reason that collectors lose excitement is because their relationship with watches stays very surface level. So, for instance, everything stays about certain brand names, whether a watch has had some hype around it. Is the resale value going to stay solid? Where is it ranked? And what are the specs? Like, that's what watches is. But I think watch collecting becomes way more interesting once you start to understand things like the movement architecture or the finishing techniques that they used or the way the dial was manufactured or the historical development. All those things can make the collecting much more interesting. So I'm not saying you have to go and get all one brand of watch or, have 10 watches from each brand or 3. There's not a number here. Even in my collection, right? It's very much I have one watch from the brands that I own. But it's not surface level. It's one of the reasons why I like making videos about things like anti-reflective coating, lug design, case materials, finishing, all those things. Because knowledge extends the appreciation that you have for your watches. I think that's important. Collectors who understand those types of things and how something is made usually will appreciate it for a lot longer. So just keep that in mind. Next, wear your watches. Wear them. This sounds obvious, but it matters a lot because watches become meaningful through association. It's very, very true. I can't tell you how many collectors that I've talked to, messaged, had conversations with, whatever, and the conversation is, well, of course I love that watch because I wore that watch when my first daughter was born. Or, yeah, I remember that watch. That's the watch that I bought while I was on vacation with my wife 10 years ago. Or that's when I reached this age. Or that's when I got this promotion or started my company or whatever it is. Watches become meaningful through association. I talk about my Dan Reuter story, and I've been pretty open with that, right? Like that was the watch that I acquired I started the process before, but then, actually got it after I beat cancer. And that to me is like really meaningful. And it's always going to have a place in my collection because of that reason. So I'm a big believer that a scratch that's on a watch that's connected to something that happened in your actual life is a lot more meaningful than a watch in perfect condition sitting in your safe. It just is. And honestly, some watches become more emotionally valuable over time because they accompanied you through parts of your life that were important. I think about that a lot. I mean, there have been watches in my collection that I've had for a long time. And I've been through some things during that period of time, and I'm sure you have too. So that's another connection you can build with your watches. Fourth, stop looking for validation. Just stop. This is a huge one in the social media era. Some collectors out there are building collections for audience approval instead of for their own personal enjoyment. It's been weird for me being here doing this and getting sometimes messages or conversations that get started with me where it's like, yeah, look at this watch that I have. I'm like, you don't have to, why are you telling me? I mean, like, I'm not saying I don't want the engagement, because I do. I love the engagement. But it's all about how that engagement comes about, right? Of it's coming from a genuine place and it's sharing, or it's throwing ideas against the wall, or like those types of things. Not, hey, check out this cool watch that I just got, or whatever. Like, I mean, great. Like, I'm happy for you if that's what makes you happy and you're, proud of that accomplishment. But again, external validation is super unstable. It always will be. There will always be someone online who's telling you, your watch is overrated or underrated or too expensive or not expensive enough or too common or too uncommon. Like, you can find both sides of that all day long in perpetuity online. Just don't. Just don't do it. You cannot build satisfaction around public opinion. It's not possible. And the best collections often make sense only to the person who owns them. And that's perfectly okay. I talk a lot about themed collections and being intentional with that. And that's something that you can usually visually see based on what I have. That's not the case for everybody. And that's okay, because they have their reasoning and their method to the madness behind how they achieved and established that collection. Now, fifth, curate instead of accumulate. I'll probably make a video on this at some point because I do think it's a relevant topic. But more watches does not equate to more satisfaction. And in fact, sometimes the opposite of that happens. Like I remember having 2 and 3 watches and not ever understanding how someone could have 4 or 5. I just didn't. And I remember having 4 and 5 and not ever understanding how someone could have 6. So it's not about the number. And again, usually a smaller collection that's more intentionally built will often create deeper enjoyment because each watch has a clear purpose, a clear identity within the collection. And then finally, take some breaks occasionally. Take a break from the content cycle. Honestly, this might be one of the healthiest things a collector can do. And I care because I'm telling you right now, sometimes you got to take a break from my stuff. That's how you know that I care. Step away from, whatever it is that's going on. There's always news, release, coverage. Stop researching for a few weeks and just wear your watches immediately without comparing them to something new that you found online. Because sometimes burnout is not caused by the watches themselves. It's just, again, caused by that overstimulation. We've talked about that. So what actually creates long-term satisfaction in this hobby? I think it comes down to 2 concepts that are core. One is appreciation, and the other is very related, and that is gratitude. Not acquisition, appreciation and gratitude. The collectors who stay happiest long term are usually the ones who know how to slow down and notice things more deeply. The way that the light moves across a certain dial when it's on your wrist, maybe the feel, solidity, that heft of a bracelet when you clasp it on the wrist. Maybe it's the interaction with the crown. You could feel that little buzzing noise, kind of crunchy sound to it. Knowing what's actually happening, right? Go watch my video about crowns. Maybe it's the finishing on the movement. Maybe it's an emotional memory that's attached to a specific watch that you had. And over time, I do think many collectors realize that the hobby becomes richer when it becomes less transactional. Again, I'm not saying you're not going to buy watches. We collect things. It's what we do. You're going to buy watches. But it's less about what should I buy next, and it's more about what do I already love about this hobby? What do I love about this watch? I wear this watch almost every day, or I wear this watch once a week, or however often you wear. What do I love about this one watch? God, just this combination of complications and dial design and decoration. I just love it. Because ultimately, watches are tiny mechanical objects designed to measure time. And I do think there's something that's kind of ironic about rushing through a hobby and trying to consume all of what's out there as quickly as possible. I just think that's kind of funny. I think one of the most important things I've learned as a collector is that you do not need the perfect collection to enjoy watches deeply. You don't need the rarest watches. You don't need the most expensive or the most respected watches. God forbid, you do not need the most hyped watches. Just get over it. What you actually need is the connection. You need some level of intentionality. You need enough patience to let appreciation actually develop, both for the watches that you already own and for the watches that you may own. And honestly, that is the entire philosophy behind this channel. Because again, I am all about you knowing and loving your watches. This channel was never meant to be about endless consumption all the time. It was meant to be about how do you build a healthier and more meaningful relationship with the hobby. Because the goal is not to own every great watch. Maybe you admire them from a distance, but it's not to own every great watch. The goal is to build a relationship with watch collecting that genuinely enriches your life. Thank you so much for watching. Comment down below and tell me, have you ever experienced watch burnout as a collector? What did it, and what helped you get re-engaged with the hobby? I would be curious to hear your story about that. And if you did enjoy this podcast, definitely do take a look at my episode from last week where I talked a little bit about the psychology of watch satisfaction and dove a little bit deeper into some of the themes that we just touched on here in this episode. So thank you again. Glad that you are here. Take care, and I'll see you all next time. Bye-bye.